Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for another round of Trellis webinars. Today, we've got Realizing Second Chances, supporting formerly incarcerated and incarcerated students as they pursue their dreams of higher education. So, I know y'all are joining us from all over the place. Teresa always says, good morning to those that are close, and good afternoon to those from the East Coast. So thanks again for joining us. I'll just allow a little bit of time for others to kind of log in before we get started. Give everybody a chance. I know there's some people traveling that can't make it today. We hope to see some of our partners in San Antonio tomorrow. For others, thanks again for being here. It looks like we've got a few in, so we might go ahead and get started. And as you're logging in, if you would do us a huge favor and just type in the chat your name, what school you're representing. We just kind of want to know who's in the room, who's joining us today. I see some of our Trellis family members here, which is great. We appreciate the support. So let's go ahead and get started. It is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Brandon Warren from Lee College, and he'll tell you all about what he does there through his presentation. But I would just like to introduce him, let you know a little bit about who's going to be speaking to you today. So, as an incarcerated student, Brandon Warren earned an Associate of Arts and Humanities from Lee College, Huntsville Center in 2004. Upon release, he finished a bachelor's and master's degree, and in May 2021, graduated with a doctorate of education at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. Since 2011, Brandon has worked full-time for two college programs inside the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He now works for Lee College, one of our partners, by the way, as the Director of Reentry Services, helping the formerly incarcerated Lee College alumni transition into society. He has also been an adjunct professor of courses in philosophy, theology, ethics, academic skills between Lee College in Huntsville and Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary on the Darrington unit south of Houston. So again, thank you for joining us, Dr. Warren. We look forward to learning from you today. So I'll let you take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here, excited to talk about what I do and possibilities for the future and helping other entities help out with higher education in prison and then higher education for the formerly incarcerated. So I'm going to share my screen really quick. Is that up? Everything looking okay? Marisol?
We see notes now.
Okay. Hang on. Oops. Here, let me- Well, I don't know what changed.
It's the nature of Zoom. It requires to adapt.
Is it still showing
No,
notes?
no,
We're good now?
we're good.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. So that's all the first slide is. I was just recently made the Director of Reentry Services for Lee College back in September. I started out as a transition specialist, which was just another term for a navigator. You may have heard the term navigator, transition specialist. Those roles in the academic world are just folks who help people from the community college system transition into the workforce or a four-year degree plan. And so my initial role with Lee College was to do that, but in the setting of the prison system. So they just recently voted to not only keep me, keep me as employed with Lee College, but also to make me director and hire a few others, which I'll explain here in a little bit. But I did want to talk a little bit about the first program that I did work for was Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. It was modeled after a seminary in Angola, which was begun in response to the 1994 crime bill that took away Pell money. And our program was specifically focusing on people with long-term sentences, lifers, several consecutive life sentences, even a couple who had their sentences from death row commuted. And the idea was to help educate them. It was a regionally accredited bachelor's degree, 125 hours. And when the students graduated, they would be sent out in teams to other maximum security prisons across the state of Texas. They didn't have to be a Christian to be a part of the program. We had atheists, agnostics, Buddhists, quite a few Muslims. What they had to do was be dedicated to changing the culture of the prison from the inside. So, where most educational programs focus on recidivism and employability skills, the focus of that program was to change the culture of the prison from the inside out. And so, focusing on people who have long sentences means that you're focusing on the very people that create and maintain a lot of the prison culture. And so, changing them then changes the culture. So, I did that for about 6.5 years. And there are over 200 what they call field ministers now. That is their official designation in the Texas prison system. That is their job. They are called field ministers, and they are on 20 something units in Texas serving as GED tutors. They teach literacy, they teach ESL, they do lay counseling with people on suicide watch, they teach classes, they just do a whole lot that's been very uplifting, very edifying for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And there's a twist to that I'll tell you a little towards the end. But I got started doing that in 2011, and I did that for 6.5 years. And I came to Lee College in 2017 as a transition specialist under a Title V Department of Education grant because we're a Hispanic serving institution, and really created a reentry program from scratch because we were the first college in Texas to offer reentry services to our students, mostly because the prison system previously did not want the colleges to have anything to do with their students upon release. It was a violation of one of the policies of the prison system here in Texas. But with my hiring in 2017, all of that changed. And now the prison system is encouraging other colleges to provide reentry services to help their students upon release. So Alvin Community College has now partnered with us to do that. University of Houston has done something like that. And I indirectly have heard that A&M has done something like that. So what I'm doing in terms of providing reentry services is is actually going to become one of the requirements of schools who want to have a college and prison program and use Pell money moving into the future. But I'll explain more of that a little later. I just want to say a few things about Lee College. So we are partnered with Trellis. And for those of you who don't know, here's just a quick few points about Lee College. Number one, we started in 1965 in the prison system. Sometimes you'll see in publications that we started in 1966, but I like to say 1965 because I do, in fact, have an article that puts us in the prison system in 1965. And that'll make us one of, if not the oldest, consecutively running prison program in the country. There are other universities and colleges around the country that have been inside the prison systems. They've stopped and started and stopped and started, but Lee College has consistently been a part of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice since the 1960s. Up until about 3 years ago, we were also one of the largest prison programs in the country. We right now are averaging about 1,000 to 1,200 students per semester. Ashland University in Ohio began offering internet-based courses through tablets, and so they quickly outpaced us in terms of size. And another community college in California exceeded those numbers, but we're still up there in like the top 3 or 4 college and prison programs in terms of our numbers. We're also on 9 different prison units, which is another distinctive feature of us. We're on 8 men's prisons and 1 women's prison. And we've been given verbal permission to expand to another women's prison and another male prison. So we could be up to 11 prisons by the end of the year. Since 1995, we've given out 10,000 individuals have been awarded a degree or a certification through Lee College. We've awarded over 15, 16,000, but that's because some of the students doubled up. Our digital data that I have access to only goes back to 95. So we've done more than that. But since 95, we've given out about 10,000 plus students have been awarded some sort of a degree or certification from Lee College. We presently offer 8 different applied science degrees. That has fluctuated in the past based on the way the prison system wants us to administer different types of college programs based on the economy. So right now, all we're offering is a associate of applied science degrees in things like welding, HVAC, culinary arts, some of the more traditional vocational career and technical fields. We also offer a business management degree, which has won us an award for being distinctive in that way. We have additional certifications in things like entrepreneurship and supervision that they can add to their associate of business management. And as it turns out, quite a few of our students do get out and successfully begin their own companies. So we started offering reentry services in 2017 with my hiring. We were the first college and prison program in Texas to do that. And then just this year, we expanded by adding 2 more staff members. The unique thing about one of those staff members, he's here today too. I'm at a conference in a hotel right now. He served 25 years in prison, and he was a member of the very first class I ever got to teach in prison. Um, and so he was my student for 4.5 years. He took that bachelor's degree program, finished, and was sent out to the Cofield Maximum Security Unit to serve for 6 years as a field minister and made parole about 18 months ago. And when Lee College offered or had a job opportunity for another reentry specialist, I immediately told him about it and had him apply for it. And we hired him and we hired another person who is a former parole officer. He was also a parole officer trainer. So we have a pretty unique team now in terms of reentry. We've got both sides of the spectrum. So I was incarcerated many years ago as a youth. I spent about 6.5 years between the ages of 16 and 24. But it's been so long since I've been there. And Tracy has a much more recent and up to date and just unique perspective on the things that the guys need and the women now when they are released. So, why should anyone support this population? That population being not only those who are incarcerated, but the ones who are released as well. Um, Number one, what you often hear in these conversations about supporting people with a criminal background is that higher education reduces recidivism, and that's true. Um, the one of the reasons that Obama brought back second chance Pell in 2015 was on the basis of a RAND study in 2013, which was a meta-analysis of almost 30 years worth of research which looked at the relationship between educational programming in prison and recidivism. The results of that study showed that people participating in education while incarcerated were 43 to 48% less likely to come back to prison and something like 13% more likely to be employed within a 3 year period upon release. They updated that study in 2018, and the recidivism rates were a little bit lower. They were 28%. But what we do know undoubtedly is that over the last 40 years, educational programming in general, higher education programming specifically, reduces recidivism. That is the likelihood of people coming back to prison. Recidivism is usually measured in terms of 3 years, but you can sometimes find it measured in 3, 5, or 9 years. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. For those of you who don't know, recidivism is just the likelihood of a person's return to prison upon release. And so it's usually measured in 3, 5, or 9 year increments. It can also be measured according to rearrest rates or reconviction rates. But the way that Texas does it in particular is by reincarceration rates. But what we do know very clearly is that education plays a very important role in reducing recidivism. One of the reasons that that's important, it should be obvious, but one of the reasons that it's important is in terms of public safety, but also in terms of taxpayer money. Ultimately, I believe that providing education to the people in prison is more important than just financial reasons or consequentialist reasons. But in terms of money, the RAND study also showed that for every dollar spent on some sort of correctional education programming, it saved $4 to $5 down the road in reincarceration expenses. So that's huge. The Vera Institute of Justice and the RAND study have also compiled data in terms of how much these things would save money for each of the 50 states. Any of the information that I mentioned, I can provide you with the links to the journal articles or the publications. I know that's very important to you all. It's very important to me. So if you have any questions or anything like that, you can email me later and I'll send you all the information. So higher education also increases employment opportunities, and that is usually the number one measure of success. So it's in one sense not coming back to prison, which would be a negative measure of something that has um, stopped being the case, bad behavior, criminal behavior, but then also a productive measure of uh, gainful employment in some way. And that RAND study also showed a 13% increase in employability within a certain time span. Um, in our field, in Lee College, since we're offering Associate of Applied Science degrees, we have a much better employment rate, I would think, because when a person gets an education in welding, they're more than likely going to go into a welding field. Whereas getting a bachelor's degree in something like humanities, liberal arts, or English, you're not really sure because it's so broad what they're going to do. But our students generally go right into the fields in which they were educated. Just briefly, when it comes to educational programs inside the prison, I know that the gist of this presentation was about helping students making the transition in the free world into college programs. But just a few things to say about college and prison programs. What it does inside the prison is very important, I think. Most of the programs are all geared towards employability and recidivism rates. They're not very much focused on the culture change within the prison, which is really important to me personally. But college and prison reduces violence in prison, which has benefits indirectly in all of the areas that you see there. Um, Oscar Mendoza, who's I want to say he's the deputy executive director of TDCJ right now. He's in the room next to me. He just mentioned that in Texas, they're 8,000 officers short. Well, one of the reasons that they're short is because being a correctional officer is one of the most dangerous and stressful jobs there is. And reducing the violence in prison would have a really important impact on things like officer turnover and officer health, officer mental health, and even their physical health. It also saves money on property damage because there are less riots and they're not burning down the house, essentially. Riots usually consist of burning everything in sight and flooding the toilets and ruining the plumbing. And then in addition to that is medical costs because they're not stabbing and fighting each other, hurting the officers. One of the studies in particular was done on the seminary program that I worked for 6.5 years, and this is done by Byron Johnson and a team out of Baylor University. It was published in a Routledge article that there was an 85% reduction in inmate misconduct while they were participating in the seminary program. So for somebody who is currently enrolled in a college and prison program, at least in that context, they were 85% less likely to engage in disciplinary violations. There's quite a bit to say about a reduction in prison violence just by virtue of attending an educational program. So how many people are actually affected by the prison system? Well, if you are following news and criminal justice at all, we've heard this term mass incarceration for a long time. Michelle Alexander published a book in 2010 called The New Jim Crow, which really popularized the term mass incarceration. There were others using it before her, but she really popularized the term and her particular theories about why we had a problem with mass incarceration. But for her, the way that she defines mass incarceration is not merely people who are currently incarcerated in the prison. It's everyone who is in some way affected by prison and the justice system. So that could mean people who are on parole, for example, or people on probation, or people who are not on parole or probation, but have a felony conviction and are therefore, for the rest of their life, dealing with what we call collateral consequences, which are all of the consequences of having a felony conviction, like not being able to get an apartment, not being able to get a job, not being able to get car insurance. And there are a lot of college students out in the free world college system who have felony convictions, who have been to prison, who are dealing with those collateral consequences. One in particular for the educational field is that many colleges often ask about criminal background with the intention to exclude those students from their institutions. As a result of that, there have been what we call ban the box initiatives. Ban the box initiatives are mostly associated with the idea of removing criminal background questions from job applications. But there's a separate ban the box movement, which is removing criminal background questions from school applications. So when I got out of prison in 2004, I took all of my education from Lee College and I enrolled in Houston Baptist University. Everything transferred. There were no problems. They didn't ask me about my criminal background. And nobody knew unless I told them that I had a criminal background. And so there are some things I'm going to say about that towards the end about what colleges can do to help students like me, because there are quite a few of them in the college system who have either felony backgrounds or have been incarcerated in some significant degree. Um, a study done in 2017 looked at what was called the growth, scope, and distribution of felonies across the United States from 1948 to 2010. And their estimate was that 3% of the US adult population had been to prison, which is kind of high. I had never even tried or thought to put a figure on how many people had actually been to prison in the United States. But their estimate was that about 3% of the US population, adult population, had been in prison at some point or another, and that 8% of all US adults have some sort of felony conviction. That study also broke it down by states. So here in Texas, the rate of people with felony convictions was over 10%. So almost 1 in 10 people in Texas have some felony conviction. My immediate thought was to question that. That seems rather staggering for that many people to have some sort of a felony conviction. That's what the study was said in 2017, and I actually haven't read any follow-ups or criticisms about that. But on the assumption that that's true, that is a massive portion of the population who has either been to prison or been convicted of a felony and is now dealing for the rest of their lives with collateral consequences. This is something that I stress when I talk to our students in the prison is that mass incarceration has affected everyone. It hasn't just affected the people who serve time in prison like myself. It's affected everyone. The reason I bring that up in the prison context is because I use it to try and tone down the us versus them mentality that the people in prison often have towards guards or people like myself coming in. Because in reality, the officers, the wardens, probably have family or friends who have been to prison and have felonies, police officers, lawyers, everybody in our society, unfortunately, is familiar with a family member or a friend who has either been to prison or has some sort of a felony conviction. That's unfortunate. But what it shows is that um, these collateral consequences that are affecting jobs and housing need to be addressed because there's a massive part of our population that's suffering unnecessarily, in my view, for things that they've done in their past. My crime was literally 22 years ago. But right now, if I were to go apply for an apartment, I would not be able to get into an apartment. Thankfully, I'm a homeowner now. But if I were to go get an apartment, they don't care about my education. They don't care about any of that. They will only look at a crime I committed at 19 years old, 22 years ago. The Bureau of Justice Statistics put out in 2009 said that 95% of people will one day be released from prison. So at any given point in the last few years, there's been upwards of 1.5 to 2 million people currently incarcerated. So that means that there's tens of millions who have been released over the years. And 95% of those people who are currently incarcerated will one day be released. And I would assume that most people would want the people who serve time in prison to have spent that time in prison doing something productive. I'm someone's neighbor. I am a homeowner now. I pay my HOA fees. And I would assume that my neighbors, if they knew about my criminal convictions, would be more accepting of my presence there if they knew that I was doing something productive with my life rather than having spent 6 years in prison gambling, looking at the walls, watching TV, and getting into trouble and becoming a better criminal. Because in the absence of religious or educational programming, that's usually what happens. So educating people in prison is beneficial for that reason, as well as several others I'll mention. And then the last thing I'll say is that children with an incarcerated parent are as much as 6 times more likely to go to prison or be involved in the criminal justice system as they get older. So if we've presently got 1.5 to 2 million people currently incarcerated, quite a few of those are parents of several children. We have millions upon millions of children who are at a greater risk of uh, following down those footsteps and continuing a cycle of violence and criminal activity. Higher education in prisons. I just want to move through this really quickly. Um, in 1994, well, I'll say that in a little bit, but right now there's over 370 college and prison programs across the country. They're usually associate degree programs, and they're usually pretty small. So when I said that Lee College has 1,000 to 1,200 students currently enrolled, that's pretty massive because the average student enrollment for any one of these programs is less than 200. And so we outdo that quite a bit. In 2019, 2020, there were 33,000 people in prison enrolled in some sort of college programming across the country. And with the advent of Pell restoration, which kicks in 2023, that's going to increase dramatically. The higher education programs have really diverse organizational structures and relationships. So it's not easy to make generalized statements about the way that they function. Some of them are just one institution, like Lee College, working with individual prisons. Sometimes there's a third party institution mediating relationships between colleges and prisons. It's really kind of confusing how the funding structures work. It's pretty diverse. In Texas, depending on the year, we've got 13 to 16 colleges in some way involved with the prison system. I say it fluctuates because some colleges they come in and they leave for a little while and they come back. But at present, there are about 13 colleges involved in the prison system in Texas. 10 of those are associate degree programs. Three of those are bachelor's degree programs. One of which is A&M, offering a bachelor of administration and management. One is the University of Houston, which offers a bachelor in behavioral science, and one was the seminary program, which is a regionally accredited bachelor's degree as well. And then U of H has one master's degree program, and U of H has been offering that since the 1970s. When it comes to higher education and prison programs offering reentry services, of the 370 programs currently across the United States, less than 50 have some sort of reentry services available to their students, like Lee College now does. I tried to network with all of them a couple of years ago. I had about 70 different professionals from all over the country, New York, New Jersey, Florida, to just get together and talk about some of the common issues that we have and how can we establish better practices. One of the first things I found was, again, that the diversity in their structures and their funding caused us to all really focus in different areas. But with the advent of Pell, a requirement of college and prison programs is that they're going to have some sort of reentry services. So helping people to make that transition from college and prison to college in the free world is about to be a really important issue among colleges. And just briefly about Pell Grants, they were in use with colleges inside the prison systems in the United States up until 1994. Before 1994, there were over 700 programs, 700 different college and prison programs across the country. In 1994, when Pell was stopped, prevented from being used as a result of the tough on crime era, within a year, that 700 plus number was cut in half. And within 3 years, it was like, I want to say like 100, 150 colleges were left. And throughout that period from 95 to 2015, less and less colleges were involved in the prison system. Obama brought back what was called the Second Chance Pell Experiment in 2015. He allowed 67 colleges to enroll students with Pell funding. The idea was that they were going to measure some of the results and see if it was effective. Lee College was one of those 67 colleges that received Pell money. But before they were able to get any of the results back, Congress decided to fully restore Pell in December of 2020, so that beginning in June of 2023, incarcerated students will now have access to Pell Grants. And what that means for people like myself is that colleges all over the country are trying to get their foot in the door now in the prison system. So Texas has 13 colleges going on right now, but there's quite a few others who are wanting to get involved in the prison system. And so now I just wanted to talk about a quick overview of what I actually do in reentry. So when I was hired, none of the colleges in Texas were doing reentry services. And this was largely because the prison system did not want them having anything to do with the students upon their release. And there weren't very many reentry programs attached to a college throughout the country. So I was given the task of creating a reentry program for Lee College based on my own personal experience and networking with other colleges across the country and learning from nonprofits and various ministries about what would a robust, functioning reentry program look like. And so this chart that I have on the screen is my lousy attempt at providing a visual of the variety of things that I have tried to do in the last few years. So the way it breaks down is that I essentially have two major points of focus. One is what I call student services. Student just means someone who is currently incarcerated. They don't necessarily have to be a Lee College student. They could have graduated, but for my purposes, a student means they are currently incarcerated. And then I have alumni services. And alumni for me just means somebody who has been released from prison. They don't necessarily have to have graduated from Lee College, but they at least attended a class or two during their incarceration experience. So that's all I mean by alumni and student services. On the student services side, I answer their mail, which, unless you're incarcerated and you don't have any friends or family, it's hard to understand the value of providing information, important information to people on the inside about reentry. So the students know that they can write me and ask me about anything relative to reentry. So if they want to know what A&M's bachelor's degree in agriculture or engineering looks like, and what kind of credits do they need to transfer that, I can provide that by printing it out and sending it to them. If they want to know what are the welding job openings in Bryan College Station, I'll print that out for them. If they want to know how to create a business plan for a barbershop, if they want to know what does the halfway housing list look like in Houston, anything like that, I essentially am serving as their research assistant. I'll look that information up and send it to them. Um, I track all of that mail. And so up until 2021, I had answered over 1,500 pieces of mail in the 3.5, 4 year period. And I was able to track like what was important to the students. 37% of those students were asking me about employment related issues. 32% of them were asking about educational programming to pursue upon release. And then it dipped dramatically. Only 17% were asking about housing. And then every other category I had, like transportation, legal issues, parole, sexual offenses, veteran statuses, all of that was less than 5%. So employment and education is really important for students in terms of making their reentry plans. So I also do classroom presentations where I go in and introduce myself, give people my contact information, explain what I can do for them. But I also, when I do that, I give them an assessment, what I call a reentry needs assessment, where I ask them, um, are you will you have a place to live when you get out? Will you have transportation? What kind of jobs are you looking for? What county will you reside? And a lot of that changes because they don't necessarily know that. But over the years, what that has shown me is that most of our students end up in Houston. A good bit of them end up in the DFW area. And most of them are going to a residential home as opposed to a halfway house. So that data is really important in helping me because up until a few months ago, I was doing this by myself. where to focus my efforts in terms of research and assistance. Um, because of what I call the shifting landscape of reentry, I created a reentry course, which I essentially I mimicked it after a regular academic class. It was 12 weeks long. We met every week for 3 hours. I was only able to offer that twice because then various grants that we received at Lee College, having some sort of reentry, soft skills training was a necessary component of the grant. So I modified it to 6 classes. What I'm really trying to get at in the reentry class is not merely providing them with resource lists, like a bunch of phone numbers and contacts, but to explain to them the importance of character, explain to them the importance of things like soft skills. So I talk about education, critical thinking, soft skills, and character because the phone numbers, the contact list, the addresses, the names of grants and programs. You all know working in bureaucratic institutions, those things change rapidly. What's true today in Brazos County might not be true tomorrow, but it might be true in Amarillo. And these things shift so greatly that just providing them with a bunch of resource lists, I felt like is necessary, but not the most important feature of a reentry plan. And so I spend a lot of time talking about things like character, character by which I mean grit and growth mindset and perseverance, creativity. What I'm trying to do is teach them how to navigate these reentry resources for themselves because there's that constant shift and change. So I do that over 6 courses, so it ends up being 18 clock hours. In doing that, I do a lot of myth busting. And if you see the resources down there, I've created reentry pamphlets with statewide resources on them. I created a reentry plan, an actual book, which is about 70 some pages long, starting off with their goals, what kind of goals do they want for their life upon release, uh, and talk to them about credit, finances, budgeting, but also talk about what they should try to do in their free time, like volunteering somewhere, and talk about reasonable expectation when it comes to rekindling their relationships with their children or their family. In those resources, what I also do is try to address a bunch of the myths and rumors that float around the prison system about what kind of money or benefits they're able to receive upon release. Moving over to the alumni services, these are what I do there is probably more in tune with what people think about reentry, which is providing referrals to employment, housing, education, whatever it is that they need. Ideally, a person will have contacted me on the inside. I will have met them in a classroom, given them my information, started a correspondence relationship, and then when they get out, I already know, what to do, what their background is, what they're looking for, and I can help connect them to whatever resources they need. Um, One of the distinctive things about Lee College, though, is that our students can end up anywhere in Texas. And I learned very quickly that it was impossible to try and have working MOUs and relationships with employers all over the state in the areas that our students were interested in. And so rather than be a job placement service or staffing service, I do a lot of referrals. But one of the ways I'm able to do that better is that I have been intentional about helping them network with each other. So, for example, I have a Wednesday meeting every Wednesday at 5:30 today. People can log in from all over the state and just ask questions or talk about whatever needs they might have. So, some of these people may have just got out last week. Some of them may have been out for 15 years and they're just there to help, like me. One of my colleagues is starting another one for people who served more than 10 or 15 years because people who have served 15, 20, 30 years have some issues that are different from someone like myself who served relatively short time in prison. And then we've also tried to start an entrepreneurship meeting twice a month for our students who are aspiring business owners. But I've kept up a contact list, which is something around like 500 of our alumni now. And that's going to continue to grow at a pretty exciting pace. And all of the things that happen in those networking sessions are pretty unique and creative. Um, in that, Lee College decided, again, to help keep me, make me a director, and hire 2 other people. And so I mentioned Tracy, who spent 25 years in prison. He's heading up the long time support group, the support group for people who have served a lot of time. And then Mr. McGinnis, who used to work for parole, he is heading up the employment side of things in terms of making more statewide contacts with employers, partnerships, MOUs, and helping funnel our students into directly into employment areas. The final thing in the middle of the page is green, and it's research, data collection, and analysis. So, in terms of doing the legwork of actually writing students, teaching classes, connecting people with employment, in order for it to be effective or meaningful to other entities like foundations, the government, or my superiors, we need some sort of data to show our success in what we're measuring. So when I started the job, none of this was in place. I had to create it. So I happened to be going through a doctoral program at the time, so I was becoming familiar myself with how to collect data and analyze it. And so I did what I could in the last few years to try and capture data and analyze it. So I did that in the form of the reentry needs assessments, but I've also got together with TDCJ and gotten recidivism stats every year for the last 3 years. I'm waiting on this year's right now. And nationally, if you look at recidivism rates, what you're probably going to see is that people are 50, 60, 70% uh, likely to come back to prison within a 3 year period. But that's very misleading. And the short story is that when it comes to Lee College students have about a 10% recidivism rate, which is significantly less than the national population. And it's uh, less than half of the Texas state population. Texas population generally is 20% recidivism rate. So historically, without any help from me, that's what the numbers look like. My prediction is that in the next few years, those numbers will go down because the reentry services we're providing are helping them make those crucial connections upon release from prison. In terms of employment stats, it's been a nightmare trying to work with TWC to get employment data based on social security numbers. Supposedly that's in the works. But I did create a survey where I just cold called our students, emailed them, tried to get them to fill out a survey. I only had about 108 do that. So it's not generalizable to our whole population. But of the people who participated, 80% of them had a job within a few weeks, making good money in the areas in which they were interested. And they largely got those jobs by family, friends, and just walking in to a particular employer. So we're doing that again this year. Now I have two assistants, and we have a lot more contacts to make, and we'll be just cold calling people and emailing them, trying to get them to fill out the survey for us so we can get some better data. If at some point we work with the TWC to get data based on social security stuff, that'd be great. But until then, we're just doing our own informal survey to try and find out what our employment data looks like. Other sort of data collection points that I look at is data collection points particular to certain grants. For example, students who have benefited from Trellis. Um, because of the usual time for recidivism study is 3 years. And at this point, I don't think we've had a significant number of students who have benefited from Trellis and have been released for that 3 year mark in order to get a reliable stat but on recidivism rates. But that's what I'm trying to do is track different cohorts and their recidivism rates over time. Um, that's pretty much all the stuff that I do in a nutshell. Like I said, I did that for 4.5 years on my own, but now I have two additional staff members who are really helping me. One of which is going to expand on the employee or the alumni network, and another of which is going to expand on the felony friendly employer network. And so the last two things I wanted to say about all of this is how can colleges in particular support this population, the population on the inside of prison and the population that is transitioning from prison to the free world colleges. So there's a number of things that you can do, but a lot of it is relative to the kind of school and their particular focus. So I was trying to think just broadly what might apply to any number of colleges. And so there's a lot of talk today about inclusivity and including people who have historically been marginalized or discriminated against and including them in all of the traditional activities that are associated with a school. And thinking along those lines, people who have been formerly incarcerated, there are higher numbers in non-white populations who have been affected by the criminal justice system. But being formerly incarcerated or having a criminal background is a population, regardless of color, that has been marginalized on the basis of that past. And so, a couple of things that colleges can do is number one, start something like a formerly incarcerated student group, because people who have been to prison and now they're in the university system, they don't usually announce it. They don't go around telling people. But if there were some sort of support group or student group available, then that's when they sort of come out of the woodworks. They started something like this in California, the Underground Scholars Initiative at Berkeley. As soon as they started to make themselves known, then other students who had served time in prison just started to, come out of nowhere and form together a network that is now supporting students in the UC system all across California. We do not have the equivalent of something like that here in Texas. I would like to help start something like that, but we don't have it. But that's an important thing colleges can do, is just as much as there are student groups for every other population or interest, having a student group of formerly incarcerated folks who can help understand, help each other navigate the college process is really important. When I was at the university, I didn't get involved in student government. I didn't get involved in any activities because I felt like I just didn't want everybody to know about my past in that way. And I'll say something about that in the next slide to finish it out. Schools can also know that if the person has been incarcerated for a while, then they're going to be grossly ignorant of basic tech and research literacy. So even though I had 128 college hours when I left prison, when I went to the university, because we didn't have internet, I didn't know how to do basic research paper. I didn't know how to function on the internet with a computer. I got a D on my first research paper, and I saved that because I show it to my students now. But I figured it out. But in the beginning, it was caused a lot of anxiety, which is normal for any college student. But at the time, I was already 25 years old, and the expectation at the university is that I should have known all of that stuff. So whereas I was good at looking at a textbook and repeating information on a test, I was clueless about technology, the internet, and how to do an appropriate research paper. Things like transportation is very difficult for them because when they get out, not having access to reliable transportation is important. So for me to take 3 university classes, each of which wanted me to be on campus twice a week, and have a full-time job, so it was very difficult in terms of transportation. And then providing study spaces, because I and many others don't have quiet time to study. The universities usually, they're really good at this. They have libraries, they have study halls, but to specifically target those people who have been formerly incarcerated or even impoverished and marginalized who don't have that kind of space at home. It used to baffle me when I heard other students talking about how they study in their office at home, and I was studying in my bathroom because I had a daughter and wife, and I just didn't have anywhere to study but the bathroom. So providing study spaces would be another really important thing. And then the last thing I'll say here is that how staff can be responsive and welcoming to system impacted students. Number one is to turn the criminal background question on its head. And what I mean is, if the school is still asking about criminal background, that is going to be a red flag to somebody who wants to come in, because their assumption is that if you're asking that question, it's an exclusion question. It's a question that is it means that you don't want them there. But if you do what I'm saying by turning it on its head, meaning that you are looking for those people who might have a criminal background to intentionally make them or welcome them into the school and help them understand, you're asking that question because you want to know if they might need additional supports and help to understand different things about the university. And so that's what I mean by turning the criminal background question on its head. And then the last two things would just be to be intentional about undermining the imposter syndrome. So the imposter syndrome is just the idea that wherever you're at in life, you don't feel like you deserve to be there or you're worthy of being there. You shouldn't really be there, which is the case for myself and many others who have spent time in prison. And then to be on a university campus, you feel like if everybody knows about your past, you'll get kicked out. And so you're just trying to be quiet and bide your time and do whatever you can do to just fly under the radar. But for staff to intentionally undermine that by letting students know that they are welcome there, regardless of their criminal past or history, will help them essentially flourish. And then the last thing I'll say about that, because someone was asking me this yesterday at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV in Las Vegas. Um, m- my last basic, I guess, word of advice to people who want to be welcoming and involved with those with a criminal background is to be authentic. And here's what I mean by that. You can take trainings all day long on how to deal with people who have experienced trauma in their life, people who have been to war, people who have experienced racism, people who have experienced poverty. We can take trainings every day, all day about how to deal with particular populations. But I think, and one of the hangups of many people is that if they don't have that background, if they were never in gangs, they didn't have a drug problem, they didn't run the streets, they didn't serve time in prison, then they can identify or help someone because they don't have the lived experience. And most of the time, I try to undermine that idea because I know that people in prison are not nearly as hung up on whether or not you have the lived experience with them, as long as they realize that you genuinely are there to help them. If they get that vibe, if they read into your body language and your speech that you are there because you actually care about them, then your past is of secondary importance, if at all. And so that used to happen in the ministry context as well. People didn't want to come in and volunteer because they felt like they didn't have that background. And I had to just explain to them that, um, people in prison have a really good skill of reading people and becoming aware of deception. And if they understand and they see that you're genuine and you want to be there and help them, then all the rest will be overcome. So be authentic. On the assumption that you do genuinely want to help people, be authentic and let that shine. And that is all I have. So if any of you have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Thank you, Dr. Warren. I certainly appreciate your insight and your knowledge. I think this is an area where many of us as educators are
Yeah.
not as informed as we could be or should be. So I appreciate you joining us today and sharing your knowledge again. So we do have a few minutes here at the end. If anybody has any questions, I invite you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen and just pop in some questions and Dr. Warren can answer. Or if you have any comments or feedback that you'd like to provide, we welcome that in the chat as well. I think you did such a good job covering everything, Dr. Warren. It doesn't look like we have any questions. Okay, there is a question.
No, are you looking at the programs for students with incarcerated parents?
Yeah.
And no, Lee College in particular does not. And I do. You mean college students or younger students? There are programs out there. Most of the ones that I know are associated with religious ministries, but they do have programs that are specifically geared towards students who have incarcerated parents. But they're not educational based. Like I said, they're religious organizations. So I can't remember the names of them. Malachi Dads, I think, is one of them. But there are quite a few organizations in that regard that help children. In fact, there was one that I was a part of on the Darrington Maximum Security Prison. And as it turned out, my neighbor, who was a 6-year-old kid, his dad was on the prison that I worked at. And I didn't know it until that day that my neighbor had a father in prison. So there are a bunch of ministry organizations that are looking to help children with incarcerated parents.
Thank you. We do have somebody who raised their hand, so I'm going to allow Steve to talk since you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Warren, for that great presentation. Um, I will say I have a good friend myself who was incarcerated back in those 90s days when it was a life sentence beyond the, the incarceration itself, and it's been quite challenging. Um, and so I really am glad to see this conversation changing. Uh, just a quick question. I appreciate your comments about, you know, that people who want to help formerly incarcerated people don't have to have the lived experience, they just have to care. Just as a follow up on that, do you find that a formerly incarcerated person wants to talk about their past and what got them into the prison, when you first meet them, or they prefer just to move on beyond that and not talk about those things?
So I don't generally ask just because that's how I was conditioned being in prison. We just don't ask. Um, so unless whatever it was in some way relevant to their finding help. So I encounter that with people who have sexual offenses. They need to tell me that because they're going to have a much harder time with education, housing, jobs than anyone else, even violent crimes like murder. If you have a sexual offense, I usually don't ask unless we're running into some roadblocks, and then I will say, hey, do you have some sort of a sexual offense? Because we're encountering problems that we don't always go into. So it really is relative to the kind of crime they committed. So I've also encountered, people who seriously hurt others, and they are not proud of that. They regret that, and they don't want to talk about that sort of thing with somebody who's not a close friend. But if you have somebody who is largely committing like property crimes, like burglary or stealing cars, then it's not nearly as big of a deal for them to talk to you about that or drug addiction. So it's kind of relative to the crime committed. If it was violent and people were seriously hurt, or if it was a sexual offense, then they don't necessarily want to talk about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We did have a comment just thanking you for a great webinar. Stillman College is on board. I will say that the way that I met Dr. Warren is because we had a student that I needed help with, and I just randomly reached out through the network. I know people in the California system, and he was very responsive and he was quick to help that student. So I am 100% confident that if you need some guidance or would like to get connected to the network and be a supporter, Dr. Warren would be 100% open to welcoming you into that network and helping you help others.
Yes, I really would, because expanding the network helps everyone. We've had people join in on our network calls from Rice University or employers. It's not just people who have been formerly incarcerated, it's other people who are just willing and interested to help and understand.
Right. Thank you so much. So, with that, I will close out our webinar today. Thank you, everybody who attended. There will be a recording available for everyone. And then, once again, Dr. Warren, thank you so much for being our partner.
Thank you all for allowing me the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.